The anniversary dinner died in the air like a candle we both pretended wasn't smoking. Its wick a black thread between us as Amelia peeled back the velvet lid of the watch box and laughed, actually laughed, like the room and the night and the 10 years were all some punchline I'd missed. The living room held its breath with me. A low hum from the refrigerator, a jazz record we'd forgotten to stop, the slick clink of her glass as she set down a half-finished Pinot Grigio with the kind of indifference that used to be reserved for junk mail. "Really, David, another watch," she said, rolling her eyes, and the way she said my name made it feel like a word she hadn't used for weeks, one she'd finally remembered how to pronounce without affection. "It's a Cartier," I said stupidly, like a brand could push a needle back into a heart, like sapphire crowns and Roman numerals could become a time machine if they were expensive enough. She flicked her hair over her shoulder with theatrical grace, the kind she'd been rehearsing in mirrors without me, and she took a perfunctory sip, the ice knocking glass like a metronome marking a tempo I couldn't keep. "My tastes have evolved," she said, and the word evolved felt like a trapdoor opening beneath everything we'd built, revealing not a basement but air and distance and a slow fall through the last year of our marriage. She checked her phone, impatience flashing like a knife's edge under a napkin, and murmured, "I have to run late for a thing." Already halfway to the door she'd come through 10 minutes ago, as if arriving were a chore and leaving were oxygen. The front door clicked shut, and I stood alone inside the echo of her perfume, that clean floral sweet scent she wore like armor when she wanted to be adored by people who weren't me. The Cartier box sat innocently on the coffee table, a tiny coffin with a hinge, a symbol of my failed attempt at romance, and that was when I saw the card I'd tucked under the lid, my handwriting peeking from beneath like an eye witnessing a crime. I lifted it with hands that trembled and unfolded the words I'd kept coiled like a serpent in my chest. "To my beautiful wife, Amelia, may this watch mark not only the time we spent together, but also the time you have left to enjoy your secret life with Bennett before it all comes crashing down." Reading the sentence out loud made the room tilt, as if the truth were a substance that changed the gravity of the air, and I knew again that this wasn't a gift but a clock counting down to an ending no one would call happy. Weeks ago, in the stupidest way, I'd found her secret phone, a thin second skin slick with fingerprints, and betraying everything its pretty lock screen pretended to protect. Strings of messages with Bennett, photographs, hotel addresses, jokes about me, our little errand boy, and the intimacy of ordinary cruelty that hurt more than sex ever could. Bennett with the slick-back hair and the easy smile that failed to reach his eyes, a real estate agent whose handshake felt damp and performative when we met him at a neighborhood open house months earlier, when Amelia stood too close to him in the kitchen and laughed at a thing he said about marble counters. I'd followed them once to the wine bar downtown, with rain needling the windshield and my pulse behaving like it had its own agenda, and I watched through a fogged window as she fed him a grape with her fingertips, her eyes turned into someone I didn't know, the kind who believed pleasure was proof of worth. I didn't go inside that night, not then. I went home and pressed my hand to the wall of our bedroom like I could hear our past still living behind it, talking softly and deciding it would remain. Tonight was different because something inside me had stopped asking permission, and the card in my hand was a fuse lit to a room drenched in invisible gasoline. I grabbed the envelope from my desk drawer, fat with printed emails, screenshots, timestamped photos I had not wanted to take, and slid it into my coat pocket with a sensation like anchoring myself to the ground so I could walk into the storm without leaving the earth. The sky outside was a bruise, purple-black and heavy, rain threatening, but holding its water as though it too wanted to see how the scene would play. The wine bar lived in a narrow street that shone with a wet sheen even when it wasn't raining. The kind of place where the staff know your name but pretend not to if discretion is required, and the front window framed them like a painting that had always been on display for anyone willing to look. I walked in with quiet feet and a loud heart. The hostess said something about a wait list, and I smiled in that polite, empty way men do when they've already made up their minds to be impolite. Amelia's back was to me, her posture elegant and relaxed, her head tilted just so as she fed Bennett a grape again. Was it the same performative gesture repeated like ritual? And I watched the grape slip, tumble, and roll when she saw me, her mouth still parted, surprise widening into a shape I'd never seen on her face. "Well, well, well," Bennett said, smirking by reflex, and I placed the manila envelope on the table without sitting, without taking off my coat, without giving him any of my familiar politeness. "Bennett," I said, my voice calm in that terrifying way calm can be when it's holding back a wave, "I have something for you." He opened the envelope and drained of color so efficiently it was like someone had unplugged him from the wall, the photocopied text messages and hotel invoices splaying out like organs exposed by a clumsy surgeon. "Amelia," I said, and her name felt like a eulogy, "you found the watch predictable. It has a unique feature." She swallowed and glanced at the box in my hand, eyes flickering to that tiny coffin and back to me, the arrogance dissolving as if washed by an acid rain only she could feel. It's engraved on the back, I said, each word a step closer to a cliff she couldn't see yet. To Amelia, may the weight of your deceit be as heavy as the gold on your wrist. Enjoy your final hours of blissful ignorance. She reached for her phone out of instinct, and I lifted mine, holding it above her reach not because I needed to win, but because the truth had already left the building in copies. To her boss, to Bennett's wife, to her parents, to the people who believed weddings were promises etched in bone rather than suggestions scribbled in pencil. The red in her cheeks blew away like dust, leaving a pale outline of the person she'd impersonated so well, and she looked small in that expensive dress under the soft light of a wine bar designed for secrets. Bennett stammered something about misunderstanding and stood up so quickly he knocked his chair, that lovely carved thing, onto the floor. It clattered like applause for cowards as he fled, his exit a smear of cologne and regret. It wasn't righteous to stand there, it didn't feel heroic. It felt like standing on a bridge watching a river rise and knowing the town would flood no matter how wide the legs braced. "We can talk," she whispered, and the words were wrong and late and thin, and I turned away because talking had been the first casualty months ago when she chose silence where confessions should go. The night swallowed me when I stepped outside, and the air smelled like wet concrete and new endings, and for the first time in a long time my heart was loud for me rather than for someone else who didn't care to listen. Open loop. Tomorrow would arrive, and with it a dozen calls, and a life would end without a funeral, and I would have to decide what to do with the quiet that remained. The calls began before dawn, as if people who had slept found me in their dreams and needed to confirm the nightmare had traveled with them back into morning. Her mother's number appeared first, a ring with a familiar tone because we'd set it years ago to sound like a chime from the church where we'd married, and I let it ring until the sound dissolved into the bland hum of voicemail, where her mother wept a little and then apologized as if grief were a breach of etiquette. I brewed coffee in a kitchen that felt like a stage after an audience has left, crumbs on the counter, candles, stubs, and glass, everything left over and out of place, the aftertaste of performance on the tongue. Lawyers existed in a fresh, practical light I'd never seen. Not shadows, not predators, but carpenters with saws approaching a house that must come down, pointing to studs I'd kissed Amelia against and saying, "We'll cut here." Her boss wrote me a brief, surgical email acknowledging receipt of the forwarded messages and maintaining a standard of professional integrity, which meant exactly what it sounded like. Amelia's job would end because her private life had spilled into their polished lobby, staining the floor in ways only HR notices. Bennett's wife, Susan, left a voicemail that began like a test pattern. Silence, breath, a soft exhale, and then a voice that sounded like a window opening, thanking me without joy and saying she'd known something was wrong by the way he smiled at his phone like a teenager discovering he had a soul. I moved through the next few days like someone walking a museum devoted to a disaster that hadn't finished happening, every exhibit only partly assembled, every placard a TBD. I slept on the couch by choice, even when the bed was empty, because the couch was where I'd confronted the evidence, the place where I became a version of myself who could act, however belatedly. Paperwork multiplied, signatures practicing my name like a student until it finally believed it, and friendly professionals repeated, "You're doing the right thing," which had the same consoling power as "you're breathing properly" to someone who cannot imagine ever wanting to stop. When Amelia finally came by to pick up clothes, she wore sunglasses despite the gray afternoon, bruise-colored sky again, our weather a partner to the mood, and carried herself like someone rehearsing remorse without understanding the choreography. "Can we talk?" she asked, and I let her in because denying entry felt like a different kind of theater I didn't have the energy to stage. We stood by the dining table where we'd marked holidays with candles, and where a week before she'd laughed at the Cartier, and she set her hand on the chair back like if she held on she might not float away. "I'm sorry," she said, "and there are sentences that arrive with receipts and there are sentences that arrive naked. This one had no tags, just a word placed between us like a flower cut from its stem, already browning at the edges." "Why?" I asked, not because I didn't know, but because the reasons mattered less to me than her capacity to face them without flinching, and I watched her eyes dart like birds scanning for predators. She talked about loneliness like it had wrapped our house and turned it into a museum of her own, about how I'd been working more, how routine had smoothed the edges of our days until nothing could cut through, not excuses, not justifications, just a map she rolled out to indicate where she believed she got lost. "And you didn't come home," I said, my voice still too calm to be trusted. "You built another home in someone else's messages in their hands." She touched the back of her neck the way she does when she's trying not to cry, and for a second I wanted to rescue her from a pain she'd made, the muscle memory of a decade raising its hand to volunteer. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, and I believed her, which was worse than if I hadn't, "but I am asking if we can end this without setting fire to everything left." I thought about the card, the engraving, the emails, the way my rage had been ice instead of flame, and I understood too late and exactly on time that I had already chosen a fire small enough to control. We'll be decent, I said, and the words tasted like iron. We'll be honest in the paperwork and quiet in the spaces where shouting would only echo. She nodded, the kind of nod you give a doctor explaining a salvageable wound, and she collected clothes into neat stacks like building small walls she could hide behind. That night in the silence that replaced even the refrigerator's hum, because silence gets louder when it knows it can win, I opened my laptop and looked up apartments in the city 2 hours away, a place with a river and bridges and streets named after trees even when no trees lined them, and I picked one sight unseen because sometimes moving isn't about seeing, it's about not seeing this anymore. The landlord sounded like an uncle, gruff and kindly, and said, "We paint on Thursdays," which was inexplicably reassuring, like a promise that even walls get second chances. I sold the Cartier watch to a reseller with a sterile showroom and gloves, and when the money hit my account, I felt nothing like victory, just a mechanical affirmation that objects transform when stories change owners. On my last night in the house, I walked room to room, touching doorframes with fingertips the way priests touch pews, and whispered thank you to spaces that had tolerated our joy and our negligence with equal patience. In the bedroom, I didn't sleep. I lay on the floor beside the bed because the carpet smelled like us, and I cried not the cinematic kind, but the small, stubborn kind that clogs the nose and confesses quiet things to the dark. Morning found me still and soft, less shattered than rearranged, and I loaded my car with boxes labeled in my handwriting. Kitchen, books, photos. I left one unlabeled on purpose, like a wild card, a reminder that not every piece of the future demands a name. As I crossed the city line, the rain finally arrived, a fine, steady curtain, and it felt like driving through beads, through a necklace someone had broken on purpose to see what would scatter and what would remain. Somewhere behind me, gossip insisted on itself. Somewhere ahead, paint dried on a Thursday. Somewhere inside, a voice I hadn't heard in months cleared its throat and said, "We are not broken, only different now." The open loop remained, a question without a question mark. When the noise ended, would the quiet be friend or adversary? The new apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up with a window that framed the river like a photograph stolen from a better life, and the first night I slept there, the radiators hissed like benign snakes keeping guard at the baseboards. The place smelled of fresh paint and dust, and the faint citrus of whatever cleaner the landlord used to impress new tenants into believing cleanliness could erase history, and I let that lie hold me the way a friendly lie sometimes can. A mattress on the floor, a thrift store table already nicked with memories that weren't mine, a chair that wobbled as if deciding whether to trust me. These were my companions the first week, and they said more by their silence than any visitor could. I arranged the books not alphabetically but in the order I needed to remember myself. The one she bought for me on our second date went last, like a period I was not yet willing to place, and the poetry I ignored in my 20s came first, spines creased, words ready to be my scaffolding now. The river's voice changed with the time of day. At noon it gossiped, at dusk it consoled, at midnight it became a low sermon delivered by an amateur preacher with a good heart and too much hope. I began walking to a cafe that served coffee like a firm handshake and croissants that flaked onto your shirt no matter how careful you were, and the barista with a crescent moon tattoo asked for a name. And when I said David, she repeated it like she was trying it on for a friend. Work followed me, of course. It always does when it loves you and pays you in equal measure. And I found comfort in inboxes that did not ask about my heart, in tasks that wanted only my hands and my plain attention. Nights were the hardest. Quiet performs a magic trick after dark, pulling out memories like scarves from its sleeve, each one tied to the next, a long, unbroken chain of moments where I could have been different, said more, asked better questions. Therapy helped. I found a counselor whose office smelled like cedar and peppermint tea, and he asked, "When did you first know you were alone?" And I answered honestly, the day she stopped telling me about small losses because big ones were on the way. He said healing was not a ladder but a coastline, and sometimes you walk along it for days before you realize the tide has changed, and I took that image home like a plant that needed indirect light. I set it near the window and watered it only when I remembered. On Thursdays, the landlord painted, and I could smell it faintly in the hall, a sweet chemical reminder that even old plaster could accept new instructions if asked politely and treated with care. I started writing again, not emails or lists, but sentences that didn't need to go anywhere except the page, and the sentences were not about her or him but about the texture of a peach I ate over the sink, and how the juice ran to my wrist and made me smile like a stranger's kindness at a bus stop. And yet looms the yet, the world kept sending me small telegrams from the past. A mutual friend texted me that Bennett had lost his job, that his wife had filed, that he'd moved into a sublet with blinds that wouldn't close properly, and that he'd started running in the mornings, as if breathlessness could absolve him. Amelia's LinkedIn went quiet. Her Instagram turned into pictures of landscapes and hands holding cups without faces, as if she were trying to become a ghost while remaining photogenic. I didn't stalk, not exactly. I observed the way a meteorologist watches the sky that's already moved on, recognizing patterns without pretending control. One afternoon, a letter arrived in an envelope I recognized from across the room, the stationery she used for thank you notes and RSVPs we used to send together, and my hands did that old tremble I thought I'd outgrown. I placed it on the table and stared at it like it might hatch, and then I broke the seal and read, David, I don't know how to match words to the harm. The truth you forced into daylight saved me from a life of lies I was prepared to make permanent. I am leaving the city for a while. I wanted to say I loved you once in a way that felt like God had a plan. I am sorry. If there is a version of forgiveness that doesn't ask anything of you, I hope it finds me. I folded it and put it in the unlabeled box, a place for things that didn't know what they wanted to be. At the cafe, the barista with the crescent tattoo asked if the storm had passed, and I said storms don't pass. They changed the shape of the shore, and she nodded like someone who knew enough to leave some metaphors alone. The therapist said the next hard thing would be trusting joy without asking for its receipts, and I laughed in that way you do when someone tells you to run a marathon after watching you limp successfully to the mailbox. Nights improved incrementally, the preaching river softened, the radiator snakes slept, my breath arrived without knocking. I went to a bookstore reading a month later because the flyer made it sound like a sermon for people who prefer paper and because the night felt like it needed a new story and I sat in the last row, the chair wobbling as usual. The author read a paragraph about a man who turns grief into a room he visits when it rains, dusting its furniture and airing its curtains but never moving in. And people around me made those small vowels that humans make when someone tells the truth. Afterward in the milling crowd, a woman with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that sounded like mercy said, "You look like you recognized your own furniture." And we stood there on the brink of something that didn't announce itself. And for the first time in a long while, the open loop in my chest didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a door. Her name was Mara, which means bitterness if you ask the Bible, but she carried it like an inside joke with the universe, turning it sweet every time she said hello, and the first time we had coffee she held the cup with both hands like a small, beloved animal. She was a printmaker, her nails stained with the ghosts of color, her apartment a small cathedral to paper and light, and the machine that pressed her visions into being with the slow authority of a heartbeat. We didn't tell the worst things first. We traded safety for lightness, talking about bridges and the river's many moods, about how Thursdays smelled vaguely of paint and how croissants refused to keep secrets. When the worst things finally did arrive at the table, I found myself speaking about Amelia with a tenderness that surprised me, not forgiveness, not yet, but the kind of tenderness you use when handling an heirloom you don't want but can't throw away. Mara didn't judge, she listened like a profession, asking small, good questions that shaped my answers into something that could be carried without injury. She told me about a man who had made promises as if words were balloons, and then let them go into a sky that didn't keep anything, and how she had learned to anchor promises with actions heavy enough to survive weather. We began to occupy the city together in small ways. The used record store where she picked albums based on cover art, and we parceled out listening sessions like dessert. The bench under a stubborn tree that refused to bloom on time. The grocery where the cashier remembered her and once forgot to charge me for parsley, and then chased me outside laughing with the honesty of someone delighted by her own mistake. The therapist said, "Be careful not to assign Mara the job of proving you're still lovable." And I nodded because the caution sounded like a familiar song, but my heart, reckless in its optimism, was already humming along. Trust, it turns out, is not a single decision but a choreography of small motions. A text responded to when it's inconvenient, a joke remembered and returned, a plan kept even when tiredness suggests cancellation. The divorce finalized in a courthouse with walls that tried to project authority and succeeded only in sounding tired. And the judge's voice had the softness of someone who knows this is the least bad outcome and still wishes there were a better one. Amelia and I didn't look at each other as the documents were stamped and handed, paper clipping our lives into separate files, and afterward she said, "I hope you find what you wanted," and there was no sarcasm left in her, just the low flame of sincerity and a suggestion that she had begun learning a language I had learned the hard way. We parted on the courthouse steps without hugging, and the sun decided to be generous for 15 minutes before a cloud remembered its job. Weeks later, on a Thursday, the hall smelled of paint again, and I stood with a roller helping the landlord because sometimes helping is cheaper than rent and more valuable than good intentions, and my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was Susan Bennett's ex, her voice steady as a plumb line, calling to say she'd mailed me something as a courtesy, closure for closure, she said, and the phrase earned a smile despite the weight of it. The envelope arrived the next day. Inside, a printed confession from Bennett's HR file. He'd violated policy, lied through an internal investigation, faked listings to massage numbers, and worst of all for his industry, he'd run out of charm. I didn't need the details, but reading them felt like closing a window someone had left open during a storm, the latch clicking with a satisfying domestic finality. That night, Mara and I cooked pasta in my small, loyal kitchen, steam fogging the window in a way that made the river vanish for an hour. and we danced badly to a record with a trumpet solo that insisted on optimism. She traced the scar on my thumb I'd gotten from an old can opener and asked about the story, and I told her the truth in full instead of in fragments. Because truth, given whole, is a gift like bread, filling and ordinary and miraculous for that very reason. When she fell asleep on the couch, mouth slightly open, hand tucked under her cheek, I sat on the floor and watched the kind of peace the body makes when it trusts the room, and I felt gratitude arrive without needing to ask if it was appropriate to invite. Of course, stories bend. They don't run in straight lines like highways designed by impatient men. They meander like rivers that remember mountains. An email arrived from Amelia a month later. She was leaving for a retreat far away. She had started therapy. She wanted me to know that she had not touched alcohol in 3 weeks, and that she had returned the last of the gifts I'd given her to charity so they could mean something again. There was no ask, only a sentence that read, "If you ever think of me, I hope it's as a person who finally became honest." And I felt something in my chest release, not forgiveness, not yet, but the knot's first loosening. Open loop, joy had returned to the room, but so had the question of who I was without a wound to organize my days around, and whether love chosen after ruin could survive ordinary Tuesdays. Tuesdays became the test, honestly, the day with no drama, no excuses, no cultural sympathy, the beige canvas upon which the heart paints its true habits, and I decided to study mine with the gentle rigor of a scientist who knows the experiment is his own life. I woke earlier than I used to, brewed coffee that didn't try to impress, and stood barefoot at the window while the river negotiated with the morning light about who would shine harder. And I learned the art of doing small things well, an art I'd neglected while trying to fix large, impossible ones. The therapist said, "You're finding competence where you once sought heroism," and I marked the sentence in my mind like a dog ear I would revisit when tempted by grand gestures. Mara and I made a ritual of Sunday markets, choosing tomatoes by smell and bread by the way the crust sounded under a fingernail tap, and she showed me how to carry basil in a glass of water like a bouquet so it would last longer, and I loved being taught like that, as if longevity were a ritual too. We argued once about nothing, truly nothing, the kind of household friction that arises when two people with different dish-stacking philosophies attempt peace, and we apologized in the same hour, laughing at how the body braces for war out of habit and forgets how to put the armor down. Trust is heavy until it isn't. Then it's a coat you forget you're wearing until someone compliments the fit. In late summer, the city held a riverside festival, the kind where vendors sell candles that smell like forest at night, and kids run with painted faces, and a band plays Springsteen covers like hymns for secular hearts. And Mara and I found a spot on the grass where the ground wasn't too damp and the sky remembered to stay blue. I saw Bennett there from a distance, leaner, older, his hair less sure of itself, and he saw me too, our eyes meeting with the awkward understanding of men who know the story that connects them isn't about them at all. He approached, hands open, and said, "I wanted to say I'm sorry," and the sentence didn't carry any freight, no luggage of excuses, just the small, bare thing itself, and I found myself saying, "I hope you do better with your next chance," and he nodded, almost relieved by the economy of it. Walking away, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only a quiet that sounded like a room after music ends, and Mara squeezed my hand, not because she thought I needed saving, but because she wanted to mark with skin what words had already recorded. That night, we lit the cheap candle that smelled like pine in December and laughed at how profoundly unlike a forest the apartment remained, and we mapped out a future that refused to overreach. A trip to the lake, a shelf we'd build crooked and love anyway, a plant we would surely overwater. The landlord passing in the hall said, "You two make the place look younger," and the compliment felt like a benediction from the building itself. An email arrived from the court with the final financial statement, an artifact of endings that read like an audit of sorrow, and I paid what was due without feeling punished, because fairness, even when it hurts, is a relief after months of moral math. Amelia wrote once more, brief, disciplined, saying she had started teaching art to kids at a community center and had learned that explaining color to a 7-year-old is the same as confessing your favorite self to yourself, and I hope she kept the job because the sentence made me believe she might keep herself. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty but out of an understanding that certain doors, once closed, must remain doors to be honored. On a Tuesday, inevitably, the river flooded a little, harmlessly, licking the promenade with a tongue of brown water, and the city responded with sandbags and jokes because that's what cities do when weather tries on a new hat. Mara and I helped stack bags, our hands chalked with grit, and a kid with a superhero t-shirt told me he was fighting the water, and I said, "We're persuading it to go another way," and he nodded like I had given him a secret. That night, exhausted, we ate cereal for dinner and watched an old movie where the lovers don't end up together, and we felt grateful for endings that told the truth about beginnings. Open loop. Resolution hovered like a bird that doesn't land until the air agrees, and somewhere beneath my sternum, the card I wrote months ago still existed, a relic of a battle I had chosen, and I wondered if it had truly done the work I imagined, or if I had mistaken firelight for sunrise. Resolution arrived not like a drum roll, but like a key turning, quiet and final, a small sound that rearranged the entire room without disturbing the furniture. And it came fittingly on a Thursday when the hall smelled faintly of paint, as if the building itself were staging a ritual in my honor. The community center asked Mara to hang a show of her prints, and she invited me to help arrange them, trusting my eye and my height, and we spent an afternoon blue-taping corners and stepping back to see if the images talked to one another in the language of shadows and light. The last piece was a triptych of river impressions, morning gossip, dusk consolation, midnight sermon, and standing before them I felt the months laid out, not in words but in texture, and my chest answered with a looseness that felt like grace. Amelia walked in as a volunteer chaperone with a group of kids from a satellite program, her hair unstyled, her face almost bare, and the children orbited her like planets that had learned the comfort of a steady star, and the sight of her with them rearranged my past a degree to the left. We saw each other at the same moment and didn't rush or freeze. We simply arrived into the fact of the present where we stood, making no claim to the old persona that had cost us both so much. A girl tugged at Amelia's sleeve and asked if I was the river man because I'd been measuring prints, and Amelia smiled and said, "Yes, he listens to water," and the sentence settled like a friendly bird on my shoulder. We spoke for a minute beside the triptych, while the kids laughed at a print that looked to them like a whale dancing. Amelia said, "I'm sober," and the word sounded like a beam set correctly into a frame, strong and unshowy. "I believe you," I said, and I did, not because her eyes were clear or because her voice held another timbre, but because the children trusted her without thinking about it, and kids are the world's laziest liars. She thanked me for the card, not in a perverse way but with the tempered understanding of someone who has walked through the hottest part of the fire and found, on the other side, a meadow she never knew existed. "The card destroyed what needed destroying," she said simply, and hearing it named without spectacle let me release the last of its heat from the room in my chest where I had kept it like a space heater, useful and dangerous. I told her I hoped she kept the job with the kids, and she said she hoped I kept listening to the river, and we smiled in the way people do when an old language is finally replaced by one that fits the mouths that speak it. We didn't hug, we didn't exchange numbers. We placed the scene gently on the shelf where it belonged and walked to our separate corners of the afternoon. Later, the show ended and the kids left with paper crowns of painter's tape on their heads, laughter trailing behind them like kites, and Mara asked if I was okay, and I said, "I am," and the sureness in my voice startled me with its truth. We walked along the river at dusk, the water in its consoling mood, and I told her about the first time I'd watched Amelia feed a grape to Bennett, the rain on the window, the smirk, the way humiliation becomes a climate if you let it, and how writing that card had felt like inventing a weather system to replace it. "You changed the weather," Mara said, squeezing my hand, and I realized the trick had never been the storm. It had been learning how to build a house that could stand in any season. At home, we cooked a meal that would never make a cookbook. Eggs with too much pepper, toast buttered carelessly, tomatoes sliced like we were in a hurry to be done with the knife, and it was perfect because it was ours. I took the unlabeled box from the closet and emptied it on the floor. The letter from Amelia, the printed HR confession Susan had sent, a photo or two that had clung to corners of drawers, and I sorted them with the same tenderness I'd used to sort my books in the first week. Some things I kept, a page of my own handwriting from the card, because the man who wrote it deserved to be remembered. Some I recycled because paper doesn't become wholly just because it survived a bad season. I wrote a new card not to anyone in particular but to the life that had made room for me again. To the ordinary Tuesday, thank you for not needing a story to be worth living. And I slipped it into the box and labeled it finally. Not broken, just different. On the window, a small moth battered itself against the glass gently, like a reminder that even fragile things are relentless, and the radiator snakes sighed approvingly as though winter had given them a script. I slept with the window cracked to let the river's sermon drift in, and in the morning I woke without immediately reaching for my phone or my ghosts. This was the climax, though no orchestra announced it. A man who had wanted to be loved more than he wanted to be honest had learned to choose honesty first, in himself and in others, and the obstacle, betrayal, humiliation, rage that dressed as control had been resolved not with vengeance but with decency, boundaries, and the careful, mundane labor of building a life that needed no audience. The title had made a promise that a card could destroy. What it destroyed was the illusion that survival requires spectacle, that love excuses cruelty, that time is a thing we own rather than a river we learn to read and respect. The door inside my chest, the open loop, clicked shut not to imprison me, but to weatherproof a home where joy and sorrow could live together without drafting each other into war. Sorrow could live together without drafting each other into war.